In the scorching cotton fields of Bloodworth Plantation, Georgia, 1853, the enslaved people whispered a name that sent chills through even the cruelest overseers. They called him Devil's White, and his real name was Ezekiel. Born with skin pale as bone and eyes red as fresh blood, he had endured 23 years of the most savage treatment any human being could survive. But on a humid August morning, when Overseer Thomas Hartwell raised his whip for what he thought would be another routine beating, Ezekiel's patience finally shattered. What followed was 9 days of methodical revenge so horrifying that the Georgia legislature would ban all discussion of the events for 30 years. Ezekiel had been born on Bloodworth Plantation in 1830, the albino son of a woman named Mercy who died giving birth to what Master Josiah Bloodworth considered a cursed abomination. From his first breath, Ezekiel was marked as different, wrong, evil. His chalk, white skin and blood, red eyes made even other enslaved people cross themselves when he passed. Master Bloodworth saw him as proof of divine displeasure, a walking reminder that something unnatural had infected his property. Unlike other albino slaves who might be sold away or hidden from sight, Ezekiel was kept at Bloodworth as a living example of what happened when God's natural order was violated. He was given the hardest labor, the worst food, the most brutal punishments. His pale skin, which couldn't tolerate the Georgia sun, was deliberately exposed to the fields during the hottest days, leaving him covered in burns and blisters that never fully healed. But the worst abuse came from the overseers, white men hired specifically to break the spirits of enslaved people through systematic cruelty. They saw Ezekiel's unusual appearance as an invitation to unleash their darkest impulses. Over the years, 9 different overseers had used him as their personal target for violence that went far beyond anything necessary to maintain plantation discipline. Thomas Hartwell was the latest and most sadistic. He had arrived at Bloodworth 6 months earlier with a reputation for creativity in punishment and a particular hatred for anyone who stood out from the norm. When he saw Ezekiel for the first time, his eyes lit up with the possibility of new forms of torment. Hartwell's favorite torture was what he called bleaching. He would strip Ezekiel naked and stake him out in the cotton fields during the hottest part of the day, watching his already pale skin turn an agonizing red, then blister, then peel away in sheets. When other enslaved people tried to bring him water or shade, Hartwell would beat them as well, ensuring that Ezekiel suffered in complete isolation. The morning of August 15, 1853, began like any other day of torment. Hartwell had discovered that Ezekiel had been teaching some of the younger slaves to read, using a Bible he had somehow acquired. Literacy among enslaved people was forbidden, punishable by death in extreme cases. Hartwell saw this as the perfect excuse for his most elaborate punishment yet. He gathered all 200 enslaved people from Bloodworth to witness what he promised would be Ezekiel's final lesson in obedience. But as Hartwell raised his whip, something in Ezekiel's red eyes changed. 23 years of accumulated rage, pain, and humiliation crystallized into something that transcended human endurance. Ezekiel moved with speed that seemed impossible for someone who had endured such prolonged abuse. Before Hartwell could bring down the whip, Ezekiel's pale hands were around the overseer's throat. But instead of simply strangling him, Ezekiel began speaking in a voice that carried across the entire plantation. "You have made my skin your canvas for cruelty," Ezekiel said, his words clear and educated despite years of being treated as a beast. "Now I will make yours mine." What Ezekiel did to Thomas Hartwell in front of 200 witnesses defied belief. Using a knife he had somehow concealed, he began carefully removing Hartwell's skin in precise strips, keeping the man alive and conscious throughout the process. As he worked, Ezekiel recited every abuse he had suffered, every burn, every beating, every humiliation, making each cut correspond to a specific memory of cruelty. The assembled enslaved people watched in horrified fascination as their tormentor was subjected to methodical torture that matched his own sadistic creativity. Some tried to look away, but Ezekiel commanded them to watch, to bear witness to what he called the evening of accounts. When Hartwell finally died, Ezekiel was not finished. He turned to the crowd and announced that justice was only beginning. He named 8 other overseers, men who had tortured him over the years, some still working at Bloodworth, others at neighboring plantations. He promised that each would receive the same careful attention he had given Hartwell. Master Bloodworth had fled to the main house at the first sign of violence, barricading himself inside while sending frantic messages to neighboring plantations and the county sheriff. But Ezekiel made no move toward the main house. Instead, he began methodically hunting the overseers he had marked for death. The second overseer, William Craddock, was found the next morning in the stables, his skin removed in a pattern that spelled out the word MRCY across his chest and back. Ezekiel had apparently kept him alive for hours, using techniques that suggested intimate knowledge of human anatomy and an artist's attention to detail. The third and fourth overseers, brothers named Peter and Paul Whitman, were discovered in the cotton gin, their bodies arranged in a tableau that recreated the bleaching torture they had inflicted on Ezekiel. Their skin had been peeled away and stretched on wooden frames like parchment, with messages written in their blood describing their crimes. Word of the killings spread throughout Georgia like wildfire, creating panic among plantation owners and overseers across the state. This was not a simple slave rebellion that could be suppressed with violence. This was something far more terrifying, calculated revenge carried out by someone who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. Sheriff Marcus Thornton arrived at Bloodworth with 20 armed men, expecting to find a typical uprising that could be ended with overwhelming force. Instead, he found a plantation in the grip of systematic terror. The remaining overseers had barricaded themselves in the main house with Master Bloodworth, while the enslaved people continued their regular work, as if nothing unusual was happening. When Thornton demanded to know where the killer was hiding, the enslaved people claimed ignorance. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing about any violence. But their eyes held a satisfaction that made the sheriff deeply uncomfortable. Something fundamental had shifted at Bloodworth, and traditional authority meant nothing. Ezekiel struck again that night, somehow entering the barricaded main house without triggering any alarms. The fifth overseer, Samuel Morrison, was found in his bed, his skin removed and arranged in patterns that recreated the scars on Ezekiel's own body. A note written in Morrison's blood detailed every abuse the man had inflicted over 3 years of employment at Bloodworth. The precision of the killings, the apparent ease with which Ezekiel moved through defended positions, the artistic arrangement of his victims, all suggested someone operating beyond normal human capabilities. Rumors began spreading that the albino slave had made a pact with dark forces, that his unusual appearance marked him as something more than mortal. 3 more overseers died over the following week, each death more elaborate than the last. Jacob Fleming was found crucified in the cotton fields, his skin removed to create a grotesque parody of religious imagery. Michael O'Brien was discovered in the blacksmith shop, his body arranged around the forge where he had heated branding irons used to mark enslaved people. Henry Caldwell was found in the plantation chapel, his skin used to create new pages for the Bible, inscribed with verses about justice and retribution. The final overseer, Daniel Webster, tried to escape by fleeing to the county seat, but Ezekiel somehow tracked him 20 miles from Bloodworth, killing him in the town square at midnight and leaving his body displayed with a sign that read, "The last debt is paid." By the time Ezekiel had completed his revenge, Georgia was in a state of near panic. Plantation owners were fleeing to cities, overseers were abandoning their positions, and enslaved people throughout the state were looking at their white oppressors with new expressions of possibility. Governor Howell Cobb declared martial law and mobilized the state militia to hunt down what official reports called the albino terrorist. But when soldiers arrived at Bloodworth Plantation, they found no trace of Ezekiel. He had vanished as mysteriously as he had transformed from victim to avenger. The 200 enslaved people at Bloodworth claimed no knowledge of his whereabouts. Under interrogation and torture, they maintained that Ezekiel had simply disappeared after completing his mission. Some claimed he had walked into the swamp and dissolved into mist. Others said he had sprouted wings and flown away. All agreed that he was no longer entirely human. Master Josiah Bloodworth survived the reign of terror, but was permanently broken by the experience. He sold Bloodworth Plantation within months, unable to function in a world where his absolute authority had been so thoroughly challenged. He died in an Atlanta asylum 3 years later, raving about the demon he had created through his cruelty. The Georgia legislature passed emergency laws forbidding any discussion of the Bloodworth killings, threatening imprisonment for anyone who spread accounts of the events. Official records were sealed, newspaper coverage was suppressed, and witnesses were threatened with prosecution if they shared their testimonies. But the story of Devil's White could not be contained. It spread through the Underground Railroad network, through slave quarters across the South, through the whispered folklore of people who understood that sometimes the oppressed found ways to fight back that transcended normal limitations. Different versions of Ezekiel's story emerged in various regions. Some said he continued his campaign of revenge across multiple states, that overseers throughout the South began dying in similar ways. Others claimed he had established a hidden community of escaped slaves in the Georgia swamps, using his reputation to protect anyone who sought his sanctuary. During the Civil War, Union soldiers advancing through Georgia encountered numerous references to Devil's White. Confederate deserters spoke of supernatural fears that plagued Southern military units. Freed slaves told stories of a pale avenger who had broken the psychological chains of slavery by proving that even the most oppressed person could become powerful enough to exact justice. In 1897, a researcher named Dr. Edmund Fairfield investigated the Bloodworth killings for a study of slave rebellions. Despite the official suppression of records, he found evidence that corroborated the essential facts of the story. Plantation records showed the employment and deaths of 9 overseers between 1830 and 1853. Medical examiner reports, though censored, confirmed the unusual nature of their deaths. Most significantly, Dr. Fairfield discovered that albinism had occurred in several enslaved families throughout Georgia during this period, and that these individuals had suffered unusually severe abuse because of their appearance. He theorized that the extreme nature of Ezekiel's revenge reflected not supernatural powers, but the psychological effects of prolonged torture, combined with exceptional intelligence and planning ability. Modern forensic analysis of the few remaining crime scene photographs suggests that Ezekiel possessed advanced knowledge of human anatomy, possibly acquired through careful observation during his own torture and that of others. The precision of his killings indicated someone who understood exactly how to inflict maximum pain while maintaining consciousness, skills that could only have been learned through direct experience of such techniques. Psychologists studying the case have noted that Ezekiel's methodical approach to revenge showed characteristics of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder combined with exceptional intelligence and organizational ability. His transformation from victim to methodical killer represented a psychological adaptation to trauma that challenged every assumption about the limits of human endurance and response. The legend of Devil's White became one of the most powerful stories of resistance in African American oral tradition. Unlike many slave rebellion narratives that emphasize group action or outside assistance, Ezekiel's story focused on individual transformation and the possibility that any person, no matter how oppressed, might possess the capacity for ultimate resistance. Today, the site of Bloodworth Plantation is unmarked farmland in rural Georgia. Local historical societies have debated whether to acknowledge the events that occurred there, how to balance historical accuracy with the disturbing nature of the violence, whether a memorial should honor Ezekiel's resistance or condemn his methods. In 2003, descendants of Bloodworth's enslaved community held a private ceremony at the site. They read passages from Dr. Fairfield's suppressed research, shared family stories about ancestors who had witnessed the events, and planted a white flowering tree in recognition of the man they called their avenger. The ceremony concluded with a reading from what was claimed to be Ezekiel's own words, preserved in oral tradition for 150 years. They called me Devil's White because my appearance frightened them. But the real devil was the system that created me, that turned a human being into something that could do what I did. I became what they made me, and they learned too late that what they created was stronger than what they thought they controlled. The story of Ezekiel challenges comfortable narratives about slavery and resistance. It forces confrontation with the reality that systematic oppression can create responses that exceed the boundaries of conventional morality or human limitation. It suggests that the most profound forms of resistance sometimes emerge from the deepest suffering, transformed into power through mechanisms that defy easy understanding. Whether Ezekiel was a man driven to extraordinary revenge by extraordinary abuse, or something more supernatural created by the impossible conditions of slavery, his story remains a powerful reminder that oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. In trying to break the human spirit completely, his tormentors had instead forged something that could not be broken, controlled, or ultimately defeated. The legend of Devil's White lives on in the collective memory of those who understand that sometimes justice comes not from systems of law or social change, but from the terrible mathematics of consequences, where every cruelty inflicted must eventually be balanced by retribution that matches its original force and intention.